Picture this. You're a parent. This is 40,000 years ago. There's no hospital within 100,000 years of you. No pediatrician. No baby formula, no fever reducer, no car seat, no parenting subreddit to panic scroll at 2 a.m. Just you, a fire, a hide blanket, and a screaming infant who cannot tell you what's wrong. And yet, somehow, that kid survived. And had kids. And those kids had kids. And here you are, watching a YouTube video, which means the whole chain held. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Keeping children alive in the ancient world wasn't just a matter of love and luck. It was a system. A brutal, sophisticated, constantly evolving system built from hard biological instinct, collective social knowledge, and some genuinely impressive ancient medicine. And when researchers started digging into how early humans actually raised children, not how we assume they did, but what the bones, the campsites, and the artifacts actually show, what they found completely rewrote the story. Because the old assumption was simple: most ancient kids died young, and the ones who made it were just the lucky ones. But that's not what the evidence says. Let's start with the oldest proof we have that ancient humans weren't just passively watching children die. At Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, in northern Spain, researchers recovered skeletal remains of at least 28 Homo heidelbergensis individuals dating back roughly 430,000 years. Among them were children. And here's the detail that matters. Several of those children showed signs of serious congenital conditions, skull abnormalities, developmental defects, conditions that would have required sustained care to survive even a few years. These weren't healthy children who died in accidents. These were children with significant physical challenges who lived long enough to leave behind bones. Plain English translation. Somebody took care of them, deliberately, for years. That's not instinct. That's not accident. That's intentional caregiving at a time when our ancestors were still hundreds of thousands of years away from anything we'd call civilization. But here's where it gets interesting. The same site shows evidence of what researchers believe may be deliberate disposal of the dead bodies carried into the pit, possibly as an early form of mortuary ritual. Which raises a question that should sit in the back of your mind for the rest of this video. If ancient humans were already thinking carefully about death, what were they doing to prevent it? The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. Here's something your body already knows, even if your brain hasn't caught up. Human infants are, by any biological standard, absurdly helpless. A foal is walking within hours of birth. A baby chimp clings to its mother independently within days. A human newborn can't hold its own head up for months, can't walk for over a year, can't reliably feed itself for years after that. Biologists call this secondary altriciality. The idea that humans are effectively born prematurely compared to other primates, because our enormous brains make full gestation impossible. We'd never fit through the birth canal if we cooked any longer. So we come out underdone and stay that way. The result is that human children require more sustained investment from more adults than virtually any other animal on the planet. And evolution, which is brutally efficient, responded to that pressure with something remarkable. It wired other adults, not just parents, to care about babies. That's where the grandmother hypothesis comes in. Evolutionary anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, studying the Hadza people of Tanzania in the 1980s, noticed something counterintuitive. Postmenopausal women were among the most critical contributors to child survival. Grandmothers foraged more, carried food back to camp, and directly fed grandchildren. And kids with living grandmothers were measurably better nourished. Evolution didn't just make parents love their children. It made grandmothers indispensable. That's not sentiment. That's a survival mechanism 2 million years in the making. The earliest deliberate, clearly intentional evidence of child healthcare doesn't come from a hospital or a written text. It comes from teeth. Researchers analyzing dental remains from Neanderthal and early modern human sites have found something remarkable in the microscopic where patterns and chemical residues inside ancient dental calculus, the hardened plaque that preserves whatever was in someone's mouth for tens of thousands of years. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, scientists have identified residues of plants with known medicinal properties, yarrow, groundsel, and in the case of one famous Neanderthal specimen from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, what appears to be a range of flowering plants associated with traditional medicine in the region to this day. Now, the Shanidar pollen evidence has been debated. Some researchers think burrowing animals may have introduced plant material after burial. Fair point. But the broader pattern across multiple sites is harder to dismiss. Ancient humans knew plants did things, and they used them, including on children. More direct evidence comes from the roughly 5,300-year-old remains of Otzi the Iceman, found in the Alps in 1991. Otzi carried 2 species of bracket fungi, Fomes fomentarius and Piptoporus botulinus, on his body. The second produces compounds with antibiotic and antiparasitic properties. He wasn't carrying it as a snack. He was carrying a medicine kit. If a lone traveler in 3300 BCE had a pharmacological toolkit, you can be certain the people raising children at permanent campsites had one too. Here's the uncomfortable truth about ancient childcare. Most of the evidence simply doesn't survive. Organic material, the slings, the wraps, the softened animal skins used to carry infants, the chewed food passed from mouth to pre-digest it for toothless babies, the poultices, the herbal teas, the nursing routines, all of it is gone. Completely. Thousands of generations of accumulated parenting knowledge, transmitted orally from grandmother to mother to daughter, evaporated before anyone thought to write it down. What we're left with is bone and stone. And bone doesn't tell you that a mother walked 3 miles with a sick child on her back every day for a week to find a particular root. Stone tools don't tell you that a community reorganized itself around a single sick infant, keeping it warm, keeping it fed, taking shifts through the night. Archaeology finds the hardware, the software, the knowledge, the behavior, the love is invisible. This isn't a dead end. It's a reminder that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The survival rates implied by population genetics, the healed fractures in children's bones that could only have healed with sustained care, the presence of elderly and disabled individuals in ancient burial sites who couldn't have fed themselves, all of it points to a caregiving system far more robust than the bones alone can show. We just can't see most of it, which, honestly, makes what we can see even more astonishing. For centuries, historians dismissed Herodotus on a particular point. Writing in the 5th century BCE, he described cultures along the Nile and in Mesopotamia where collective, community-based child-rearing was normal, where children were fed, watched, and raised not just by parents but by the broader group, where wet nursing was formalized and widespread. Scholars called it exaggeration, romanticization, the ancient tendency to project ideal social arrangements onto faraway peoples. Then the bioarchaeologists arrived. Analysis of bone chemistry, specifically isotopic analysis of strontium and oxygen ratios in ancient teeth, has allowed researchers to track where individuals spent their childhoods versus where they died. Studies of ancient Egyptian and Near Eastern populations have found consistent evidence that children were sometimes raised in households other than their biological parents, and that nursing by non-mothers was common enough to show up in the biological record. We've also found wet nursing contracts, actual written contracts, from ancient Mesopotamia, specifying payment terms, dietary requirements for the nurse, and conditions for the child's care. These documents date back over 4,000 years. The practice wasn't a curiosity. It was infrastructure. Herodotus wasn't romanticizing. He was reporting. We just didn't have the tools to verify it until recently. That's the thing about ancient sources. Sometimes they were right and we were just too skeptical to listen. Here's what makes the child survival story genuinely extraordinary. When researchers look across cultures with no known contact with each other, separated by oceans and millennia, they find the same solutions, invented independently, over and over again. In Mesoamerica, the Maya used the cradleboard, a rigid frame that secured an infant to the caregiver's back, freeing hands for work while keeping the baby close. In Central Asia, Mongol and Turkic nomadic cultures developed virtually identical devices. In sub-Saharan Africa, variations of back carrying using woven cloth appear in archaeological and ethnographic records going back thousands of years. In pre-contact North America, numerous independent cultures developed their own versions. Same problem, same solution, no communication required. The same pattern shows up in infant nutrition. Across ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, and Mesoamerica, we find evidence of supplemental feeding vessels, small pots or ceramic devices designed to deliver liquid food to infants who couldn't nurse. Some of these vessels are shaped deliberately for small mouths. Researchers analyzing residue from ancient Egyptian feeding vessels found traces of animal milk and grain mixtures. Proto-formula, essentially, developed simultaneously on multiple continents. What this tells us isn't that ancient humans were copying each other. It tells us that the problems of infant survival are universal, and that human intelligence, when faced with the same pressure, converges on similar answers. That's not coincidence. That's our species doing what it does best. Strip away the sentiment entirely and look at child survival from a pure survival math perspective, and the investment still makes sense. Hunter-gatherer groups had birth intervals, the time between children, of roughly 3 to 4 years on average, largely because extended nursing suppresses ovulation. That means each child represented years of reproductive investment before the next one arrived. Losing a child wasn't just emotionally devastating. It was a significant biological setback to a group's reproductive future. Infant mortality was high by our standards. Estimates from skeletal populations suggest somewhere between 30 and 50% of children in many ancient populations didn't reach adulthood. But here's the critical point. That number would have been catastrophically higher without active intervention. The groups that developed better childcare systems had more surviving children. More surviving children meant larger groups. Larger groups meant more hunters, more gatherers, more defenders, more knowledge carriers. Childcare wasn't charity. It was group-level competitive advantage. This explains why the knowledge was so carefully maintained and transmitted. Why grandmothers were biologically selected to survive past reproductive age. Why communities reorganized around sick children. Why wet nursing became a formalized profession. Every single mechanism that supported child survival also supported group survival. The ancient parent who stayed up all night with a sick child and figured out which plant helped the fever break wasn't just saving a baby. They were accumulating knowledge that would save the next one, and the one after that. Every child who survived carried that investment forward and passed it on. And then something shifted. As human societies moved from small, mobile bands into settled agricultural communities and eventually into cities, the tight web of communal child-rearing that had sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years began to fray. In hunter-gatherer societies, children were integrated into community life from the earliest age, present at adult activities, mobile with the group, surrounded by multiple caregivers who each held pieces of the knowledge needed to keep them alive. That knowledge was distributed, redundant, resilient. Agricultural settlement changed the math. Families became more isolated units. Land ownership concentrated resources. Class stratification meant that wealthy children and poor children now lived in radically different survival environments. A gap that barely existed when bands of 30 people shared everything. In ancient Rome, infant abandonment was legal and common enough that it generated its own economic ecosystem. Exposed infants collected and raised as slaves or, occasionally, adopted. The same civilization that produced detailed agricultural manuals and sophisticated aqueducts had no framework for protecting the children it deemed inconvenient. In medieval Europe, child mortality rates in urban centers sometimes exceeded those of the Paleolithic. Not because ancient medicine was better, but because cities concentrated disease, disrupted breastfeeding through wet nursing markets driven by fashion rather than necessity, and severed the multigenerational knowledge networks that had kept children alive for millennia. The grandmother didn't disappear. But in a 3-story tenement in 14th century London, she might be 2 cities away. The accumulated knowledge was still there. The network that carried it had collapsed. Progress, it turns out, is not always linear. And sometimes what we call advancement is really just trading one kind of survival knowledge for another, and not always getting the better end of the deal. So here's what we actually know. Ancient humans did not passively accept child death as inevitable. They built systems, biological, social, medicinal, technological, to fight it at every stage on every continent across hundreds of thousands of years. The survival of any one of those children was never a solo act. Here's the honest reframe. Every human being alive today is the product of an unbroken chain of communities that cared enough to try. Not just parents. Grandmothers who outlived their fertility because evolution needed them to. Wet nurses with contracts. Camp members who took shifts through the fever. Herbalists who memorized which root did what. Anonymous humans at Cima de los Huesos who kept a child with a congenital condition alive long enough to leave bones for us to find 430,000 years later. Think about Otzi and his fungi medicine kit. The Hadza grandmothers foraging at dawn. The Mesopotamian wet nursing contracts written in cuneiform on clay tablets. The identical baby-carrying devices invented independently on 5 separate continents by people who never knew each other existed. The Roman child abandoned on a hillside and the Paleolithic child with a healed fracture that could only have healed because someone carried them for months. None of that was inevitable. All of it was chosen. You are, right now, the living result of thousands of generations of people who made that choice, who decided that the child in front of them was worth the effort, the sleepless nights, the shared food, the medicinal knowledge passed down through whispered instruction from one woman to the next across an unimaginable span of time. That's not history. That's your inheritance.